It's only week 4, but I'm ready to start putting some Jets on the hot seat. Big names like Steve Wilks and Breece Hall, small names like Tyler Johnson, but not head coach Aaron Glenn just yet. All that today on Locked On Jets.
You are Locked On Jets, your daily New York Jets podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Welcome. This is the Locked On Jets podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. It is Tuesday, September 23rd, 2025, and I'm your host, John B. from ganggreenNation.com. Thanking you so much for making the show your first listener, first watch every day, and a big shout out to you everydayers. This is a daily podcast covering the New York Jets with new episodes each day through the week, Monday through Friday. Our episode today is brought to you by FanDuel. Right now, new customers can bet just $5, and if your bet wins, you'll get $300 in bonus bets to use across the app. Well, it has been a rough start to the 2025 season for the New York Jets. This team is 0-3, and I don't think it's too early to start putting some people on the hot seat. I have some big names on this team I'm ready to put on the hot seat. I have some small names, but I'm not ready to say Aaron Glenn should be on the hot seat at this point in time. And I'm going to explain all of this on today's episode. So let's talk about my big names who I have on the hot seat right now. There's one on offense, one on defense. One of these is a player, one of these is a coach. One has been bad through the first 3 games of the season. The other just had a bad third game, but an alarmingly bad third game. The two big names I have on the hot seat right now for the New York Jets are Steve Wilks and Breece Hall. And their hot seats take very different forms. And when I say they're on the hot seat, that doesn't mean I'm ready to get rid of them just yet, but I think that their performances have been alarming. For Wilks, it's been through the first 3 games of the season. For Hall, it was a bad week 3, but it was a week 3 that really set off alarm bells for me. Let me start by talking about Wilks. And I think that this is a Jets defense, in fairness, that does not have the personnel in place to run the type of scheme that Aaron Glenn and Wilks want to put in successfully. I think that there are issues with the roster, but there are just things that have been unacceptable through these first 3 games. First 2 weeks, the Jets give up 30 points back to back. And a lot of the production Buffalo and Pittsburgh had were based on Jets errors. The first game, the Jets kept busting coverages. That's how Aaron Rodgers threw 4 touchdowns. Week 2 against Buffalo, the run defense was awful. Guys were playing undisciplined football, flying all over the place, not being where they needed to be. And then against Tampa Bay, I guess the defense was a little bit better because they started forcing field goals. But if not for the Will McDonald leap over the line, the Jets would have allowed points on 7 of the 11 Tampa Bay drives. That's not good enough. And if not for the Will McDonald leap, they would have allowed 10-play scoring drives on 4 of the 5 second half possessions. I think that there are a couple of issues with Wilks that I see. Number one is I wonder whether he and Aaron Glenn combined are just too old school. I think there are certain things an old school mentality brings to a team, but you want to have a balance of guys with new ideas, guys who understand the modern game with an old school hard-nosed mentality. I think the play calling, you see the Jets blitz an awful lot. And I wonder whether this is just too much of that dated mindset that we have to get after the quarterback no matter what, whether or not it makes sense. And there's one play call in my mind that really sticks out to me. It was the Sterling Shepard 20-yard run on a screenplay that essentially gave the Bucs a chip shot field goal to win the game. I wrote an article about this yesterday on ganggreenNation.com. The Jets blitzed 8 guys, and the Bucs sent 4 guys out into patterns. So you had 4 receivers with 8 blitzers. You could do the math. There's only 3 defenders to cover those 4 receivers. That's a type of blitz that's just completely outdated. I mean, that's the type of blitz that's been obsolete in the NFL for decades. I've been watching the NFL for over 30 years, and even when I was watching as a kid, that's the type of blitz you can't run. And Wilks ran it. And you could say, well, maybe somebody messed up their assignment. There was another issue with the design. The Jets receivers were giving the Jets defenders were giving Tampa Bay receivers a 10-yard cushion. If there's an all-out blitz against a veteran quarterback like Baker Mayfield, what do you think the first thing he's going to look for? He's going to look for a quick outlet. So essentially, you're giving these receivers free releases and 10 yards of cushion when Mayfield's looking to get rid of the ball quickly because you're all out blitzing. Just a horrible design, a horrible play call. And you know what? I don't even think it's an excuse if guys weren't sure of their assignment, because we've seen guys who were not sure of their assignment all 3 games so far this season. And that's a key part of coaching to me, is making sure guys are comfortable with what they're doing. Because you see this happen a lot in the NFL. You see it happen a lot in college where the scheme is too complex for guys. And if the scheme's too complex, you got to scrap it. You got to come up with something new. I went to Catholic school in high school, and I remember the year I took chemistry. We had a teacher change about halfway through the year. So about halfway through the year, Sister Helen Marie came in, started teaching us chemistry. And she gave us this one test. And she gave the test back to the class. And she said, you know what? Everybody did poorly on this test. If one student messes up, if one student performs poorly on a test, I blame the student. If every student performs poorly on the test, it's the teacher's fault. So I need to do a better job teaching. And I think that's true of NFL schemes. If players don't know where they need to be, then that's on the coaching. And I've seen this happen too frequently with the Jets. Now, I'm not saying you fire Wilks after 3 games, but I'm saying that if things don't start improving, when we get to the end of the season, the Jets are going to have to look at changing defensive coordinators because this seems like, first of all, a bad match with Glenn. You see bad play calls. I mean, how do you put Brandon Stevens one-on-one with Mike Evans in the red zone? Sometimes coaches get blamed because players don't execute, but there's no way you can tell me the Jets maximize their odds of success by having Brandon Stevens one-on-one with Mike Evans in the red zone. That's like an automatic throw to Mike Evans and an automatic touchdown. And then guys just not really knowing where they need to be. Too many things going wrong with Wilks right now. This got to be cleaned up. Glenn wanted to be the CEO coach that delegates. Well, if the guy he's delegating to isn't getting the job done, we need to see improvement, or at the end of the season, we're going to need to see something change. That brings me to my second guy, Breece Hall. Now, Breece Hall is not going to be a guy the Jets get rid of. Breece Hall's contract is expiring at the end of the year. The question is whether the Jets look to trade Breece Hall at the deadline. And if you go back to week 1, the week between week 1 and week 2, you heard an excited podcast host here on Locked On Jets because I had given up on the idea that Breece Hall could be an elite back. And then I saw Breece in week 1. He looked fast. He was decisive with his reads, which is the most important thing for Breece because Breece has the home run speed, but he has struggled with leaving yards on the field because he dances too much in the backfield. Week 1 comes against the Steelers. He looks like a completely different back. And he got me excited. And you could probably tell that first week after the Jets had an explosive offensive day. I was just hoping, if you go back to those podcast episodes between the Pittsburgh and Buffalo game, you probably just heard me like trying to talk myself into the idea the Jets could have an explosive offense. And Breece was going to be a key part of that. Well, the Tampa Bay game came on Sunday. It was a bad performance by Breece, carried 9 times for 21 yards. And there's more under the surface to that. 9 carries for 21 yards. One of those was a 17-yard run against a kind of a light box. So really only one successful run all day. And I went back on the film and watched the other 8 carries, the 8 carries that weren't successful. I found that on 3 of them, the blocking really gave Breece no chance. On 5 of those carries, Breece was at least partially responsible. Now, the blocking wasn't good on them, but Breece could have got more yardage. Breece left yardage on the field on 5 of the 8 unsuccessful carries he had. And you can compare that with Braylon Allen, who, isn't as talented as Breece, but carried 6 times for 30 yards, a 5-yard average. Braylon hit the holes. That was the difference. Sometimes grinding out 3 yards instead of a loss of 1 because you're decisive is a big deal for the offense. And sometimes when you try and grind out 3 yards instead of taking a loss of 1, you break a tackle and you pop something big. Braylon Allen may not have the talent of a Breece Hall. In fact, he doesn't. He's nowhere near as talented as Breece Hall. But at the running back position, it's better to have a back who's less talented who hits the holes decisively. We've talked a lot on this show leading into the season about the possibility of Braylon Allen supplanting Breece Hall as the number 1 back on this team. And through the first 2 weeks of the season, it did not look like that was really on the table. For me, this is more than one bad game for Breece because Breece kind of reverted to the bad tendencies that we saw through the last 2 seasons. So this is the back we saw on Sunday resembled Breece Hall a lot more over the last 2 years than the back we saw at week 1 and even week 2, where he didn't produce much, but was decisive. And the Jets are probably going to have to make a decision on Breece sooner rather than later, whether they deal him at the trade deadline. For the first 2 weeks of the season, I would have said, there's no way you trade Breece. I'm not ready to say it now. Again, hot seat doesn't mean you get rid of somebody. Hot seat means that you are on notice, that, that performance is unacceptable. And I think that the performance we got from Breece on Sunday should raise alarm bells because it's reverting to a guy who really struggled the last 2 years in a critical area of the game. Now, head here on the Locked On Jets podcast, we'll turn our attention to some smaller guys who I think either need to improve or head to the bench, guys who aren't really big names, but guys who are kind of blocking progress for this team. I'll explain as we continue here on this Tuesday edition of Locked On Jets. Today's episode of Locked On Jets is brought to you by 5-Hour Energy. Caffeine just got a flavor upgrade. 5-Hour Energy shots deliver tasty caffeine in 17 bold flavors. Each 2-ounce shot packs the caffeine of a premium 12-ounce cup of coffee, plus B vitamins and nutrients with zero sugar and zero crashes. They are portable, big taste, tiny shots. You can take it anywhere and get that boost when you need it. It kicks in fast, and it's sugar-free, so you don't have to worry about crashing later. Enough with boring, flavorless caffeine. It's time to give your caffeine a flavor upgrade with 5-Hour Energy shots. Get the favorites you love or be bold and try something new in-store and online at www.5hourenergy.com. Again, that's number 5, HOURENERGY.com or Amazon today. Thank you so much for making Locked On Jets your first listen or first watch every day. And a big shout out to you everydayers. This is a daily podcast covering the New York Jets with new episodes each day through the week, Monday through Friday. Today, we are putting people on the hot seat on Locked On Jets. Now, being on the hot seat does not mean you necessarily get replaced immediately. It just means your performance is not good enough. And if things don't change, if things don't improve, then you will get replaced in due time. We talked about two pretty high-profile guys, the defensive coordinator, Steve Wilks, and running back Breece Hall in our first segment. I'd like to turn my attention now to some guys who are smaller names. The 2025 Jets overall are a very young team. There's a lot of youth through this roster. But despite the overall youth, there are a lot of guys who are veterans who really are not high performers, who are taking up snaps. And I'm going to do something that right now that surprises even me. I'm going to suggest that the 2025 Jets coaching staff should take some inspiration from the 2021 Jets coaching staff. And the reason I say that is not because Robert Saleh's coaching staff was good. Robert Saleh was a failed coach, and the 2021 Jets were an awful football team. But they did something that year that I thought was kind of smart. Like the 2025 Jets, this was the first year in kind of a new regime. It was the first year in a rebuild, and they knew they weren't going to be very good. So what they did was just get young players on the field as much as possible, get these guys some reps. And a lot of the guys who got reps that year were not really high-level prospects. But the mindset behind it was, first of all, these guys will improve with playing time. And second, maybe somebody will surprise us. Maybe somebody will take these reps, run with it, and take on a bigger role on the team. Now, unfortunately, that really didn't happen. But I still think the mindset was good. In the NFL, coaches kind of have two competing goals. One is they're trying to win games. Two is they're trying to develop talent. And for the most part, winning games takes priority, because if you don't win games, you're fired. So developing talent is kind of a distant second. And that changes once you're eliminated from the playoff race. Once you're eliminated from the playoff race, you'll start seeing young players get more reps, because if you can't make the playoffs, you're at least trying to develop talent for the future. There are a handful of exceptions in this league where you can prioritize developing talent. And typically, it's a first-year coach situation where you have a new regime coming in where they know they're not going to get fired after the season, and they have the luxury of just focusing on developing talent because they know they're not going to be that good anyway. And, you look across this roster, I just don't see the argument to continue giving Tyler Johnson reps. He had a critical drop against Tampa Bay. In fact, that drop was a crusher. And what drove me crazy about it wasn't just the drop. It's the sequence of events. In the first half, on a third down play, Tyrod Taylor took a sack. The Jets had no idea what Tampa Bay was doing. They dropped the defensive end. They blitzed the linebacker in a slot corner. Jets could not pick up the slot blitz. Tyrod Taylor went down. You get to the late in the third quarter. Similar situation. Tampa Bay runs the same defense. Drop a defensive end, blitz a linebacker in a slot corner. The Jets had an answer for it. They lined up Allen Lazard tight to the formation, which made it tougher to blitz the slot corner because the slot corner didn't have the same wide angle he did on the blitz in the first half. Lazard was also around to chip, so he was able to chip one of the defensive pass rushers and knock him over. The Jets had an answer. So the Bucs ran the same thing. Bucs ran a defensive play in the first half successfully. Jets schemed up an answer for it. Had Tyler Johnson wide open. Tyrod Taylor throws a perfect pass, and Tyler Johnson drops the ball. I'm not saying Tyler Johnson's going to be a drop machine for this team, but I just don't see what he brings to the table. And he's getting too many reps. And look, Arian Smith may not be the greatest prospect in the world, but I don't know that Tyler Johnson should be getting any reps that could go to Arian Smith. Tyler Johnson can play if Arian Smith needs a rest or something like that. But, I said this at the outset of the season. I said this on Cutdown Day. There's really no reason for a team that's rebuilding right now to have 3 veteran receivers with as minimal production as you get from Josh Reynolds, Alan Lazard, and Tyler Johnson. So, at the wide receiver position, Arian Smith needs to get reps. At the defensive end position, can we just stop giving Michael Clemons snaps? Now, I know when Jermaine Johnson's injured, Clemons has to play, but Clemons is producing nothing. The only time Clemons is noticeable is when he makes bad plays. In the game Sunday, it was a face mask. Maybe it was a shaky call, but we also know that Clemons has a reputation, and Clemons is not going to get a close call. If it could go either way, Clemons is going to draw the flag because of his reputation. And then on a critical play, he got single blocked by a tight end. He couldn't get off a tight end block, which allowed Baker Mayfield to have a big scramble on a bootleg play. At some point, you just have to say this is enough. Braden McGregor, wasn't that great on Sunday. Neither was Tyler Barron. But again, these are younger guys where at least if you give them reps, it may not result in anything, but maybe they develop into quality rotational players. You can use these reps to benefit the team. Again, it's not like you're replacing guys who are producing at a high level. Brandon Stephens, I know they gave him a lot of money, and I know you're going to be hesitant to bench a guy a month into a season after you gave him a big payday, but he's been doing nothing to merit staying on the field. And I'm not going to use the word accountability. I think that's become too much of a buzzword around this team. I don't think you need to bench a player every time he makes a bad play, but at some point, you're not really improving the team by having Brandon Stephens out there. Azareye'h Thomas got his first work on Sunday when Sauce Gardner left the game. Actually had a really important pass play late in the game where he played good defense on Ibuka from Tampa Bay. Ibuka almost made a circus catch, but Thomas was in good coverage. And, a few weeks ago, I was skeptical of the idea of replacing Brandon Stephens with Thomas. But you know what? Stephens is just so bad that I just don't think, even if he is better, I think those reps might be better off going to Thomas. And then at the safety position, you had Malachi Moore make his first start in place of an injured Tony Adams. I don't think that should change. In fact, the only thing I would consider is whether Cisco or Tony Adams should start in the other spot if once Tony Adams becomes healthy. I thought Moore held up okay. And I guess one of the positives is we are starting to see these young guys get more snaps. And, even if you're not going to make them full-time players right now, even if you don't feel like they're ready for a full slate of snaps, at least start to increase their snap total. And the Jets have started to do this. Now, part of it was due to injury. Jermaine Johnson was out, which meant the young defensive ends got more snaps. Tony Adams was out, which meant Malachi Moore started. Josh Reynolds was out, which meant, probably contributed to Arian Smith and his snap count increasing. And obviously Sauce Gardner getting injured is the reason Thomas was in the game. But I think that this is what you got to look to for the Jets going forward. I think the deeper we get into the season and the more games you lose and the more it becomes clear that this is not a season where the team is going to be terribly successful, you should start getting these young players more snaps. Now, again, I'm not saying that any of these guys is a high-level prospect. I'm not saying any of these guys is going to be part of the Jets core going forward. In fact, I think the spread on these guys, the over-under for success is, can they develop into good backups or role players? If one of these guys developed into a starter, it would be fantastic. I think a more realistic goal for these guys, because they don't have really top-notch scouting reports, because they don't really have elite skills. The goal would be to get them to a point where they can at least be contributors for when the Jets are better. But I think that that's a more worthy cause, putting them on the field to try and get them there, than watching Brandon Stephens continue to fail, or watching Michael Clemons continue to fail, or watching Tyler Johnson not produce for you, or whatever you're getting at the safety position right now. I understand that we're talking about UDFAs, we're talking about late round picks. They usually don't pan out, but with the Jets this year, because the team's not going to be good, you do have the luxury of prioritizing player development over the way most teams have over the ability most teams have. So I think that, we've reached the point 3 weeks into the season. You've got veterans who aren't producing. Bill Parcells used to call guys like this progress stoppers, where they prevent younger guys from taking on bigger roles, from getting the reps they need to develop. I think right now the Jets have too many progress stoppers on this team. And again, I don't have a problem with it if it's a slow sort of move where you just start increasing the young guy snap counts week to week and you start decreasing the older guy snap counts week to week. I think that that's a process that should start to continue, though. If the older guys start producing and they just run off a couple wins here, then I'll change my mind on that. But I think we've reached the point. I think we've passed the point where any of these guys should just get a starting job based on the fact that they're older players. Now, there's one person I don't think is on the hot seat yet. Aaron Glenn, the Jets head coach, is getting a lot of grief. I'm not saying Aaron Glenn's doing a good job, but I think we need to consider the important attributes of a head coach when we talk about Aaron Glenn and thinking about what is important going forward. I'll explain all of that as we continue here on this Tuesday edition of Locked On Jets. Today's episode of Locked On Jets is brought to you by FanDuel. The NFL season has arrived, and FanDuel is making sure you're ready for kickoff with a can't-miss offer. Right now, new customers can bet just $5, and if your bet wins, you'll get $300 in bonus bets to use across the app. FanDuel fits however you like to bet. Player props, building a same-game parlay, or even jumping in live as the action unfolds. It makes every game more exciting, whether you're watching the Jets or just keeping an eye on your fantasy lineup. It's quick, easy, and the best way to add a little bit more energy to Sundays, or in this case, Mondays, because in Week 4, the Jets are playing at the Miami Dolphins on Monday Night Football, the Jets' annual trip to South Florida to take on their AFC East rival. And even though the Dolphins have been awful this year, they're 0-3, they are a 2.5-point favorite against the Jets. It shows you the lack of respect the New York Jets are receiving right now, and tough to blame anybody who lacks respect for the Jets because of how they've played. This game currently has an over-under of 44.5 points on FanDuel. So are you ready to play? Download the FanDuel app now by visiting FanDuel.com to get started. That's FanDuel.com to place your first $5 bet. This is the Locked On Jets podcast here on this Tuesday. We're talking about people who should be on the hot seat for the New York Jets after just 3 weeks of the season. And I don't think any of these is really unfair. I don't think I've been unfair in any of the guys that I've mentioned. Steve Wilks has just done a horrible job as defensive coordinator. And I think after 3 weeks, you have to start asking questions when it's been this bad, whether he's the right guy. Now, you're not going to fire him after 3 weeks. You give him an opportunity to fix things, but things have got to get a lot better quick. For Breece Hall, it's a lot of the same issues that have plagued him the last couple of years. So this is not just a 3-week thing. This is a bad game on top of 2 years where you've seen the same flaw hold him back. And then the other guys I mentioned, whether you're talking Tyler Johnson, Michael Clemons, the safeties, Brandon Stevens, these are guys who really have never been high-end players in the NFL. I'll tell you one person, though, who I think is getting too much criticism right now, and that's Jets head coach Aaron Glenn. And I don't say that from the standpoint that I think Glenn has done a good job. And I'm not going to be the person who starts, citing off the stats of, well, look at how Bill Walsh began his career, look how Tom Landry began his career, look how Bill Belichick began his career, because there's no point in doing that. There's no point in comparing Aaron Glenn to some of the greatest coaches who have ever run teams. But I think we need to understand what's important when you evaluate a head coach. And I think we need to understand the time frame for evaluating a head coach. Evaluating a head coach can only happen over the long haul. And a couple of weeks is not going to tell you about a head coach's quality. And I know you're not going to want to hear what I'm about to say because you've watched bad football for the better part of 14 years. But the reality is that Aaron Glenn is learning on the job right now. He has never been a head coach before. And you see this happen frequently where guys are sent to the head job and they think they got it all figured out. And it turns out it's a lot tougher than they realize. The question for a head coach is not how you begin your career. One of the things that sets the good head coaches from the guys who fail apart for me is how do you turn it around when everything is working against you? Do you have the ability after things have collapsed on you to right the ship? That's the real question. I mean, let me give you some names. Adam Gase, Ben McAdoo, Matt Nagy, Eric Mangini. You know what they have in common? All four of them made the playoffs year one as a head coach. All four of them entered the league. All four of them, got their team, had great success year one. Then things fell apart year two. And once things fell apart, they had no ability to right the ship. And then you have guys who really struggle year one. I'm not going to go into those names because it would be comparing Glenn to some of the greatest coaches of all time. And there are lots of guys who struggle year one who never figure it out. But this has to be judged from a longer term perspective. Can Glenn respond to adversity? And that is not, can he avoid a 2-game losing streak turning into a 3-game losing streak? It's not, can he avoid an 0-4 start? It's the type of thing we will only be able to determine over the long haul. And part of that requires adjustments. I hesitate to make any Aaron Glenn, Dan Campbell comparisons because that's the low-hanging fruit. And again, like I don't want to make Aaron Glenn out to be Dan Campbell yet before he's even won a game as a head coach. But when Campbell took over Detroit, everybody knows they got off to a terrible start. Everybody knows it took a long time for Detroit to win their first game. But one of the things that people forget about Dan Campbell is his first year, his offensive coordinator was Anthony Lynn. And that was a hire that in a lot of ways is similar to the Jets hiring Steve Wilks as their defensive coordinator. And Lynn, you had a former head coach, and I think for a first-time head coach, it makes sense to bring in a guy who's a former head coach, a guy who can kind of be a sounding board, who has been in that role before, who understands, some of the challenges a first-time head coach faces. And also, when you get a former head coach as a coordinator, it's viewed as kind of like a star-level hire. Well, things did not really work out for Anthony Lynn in Detroit as their offensive coordinator, and Campbell made a coordinator change after that first year, and he promoted Ben Johnson. And as you probably know, Ben Johnson helped take the Lions offense to new heights. He turned out to be a phenomenal coordinator and is now the head coach of the Chicago Bears. That's just like one example of the type of adjustment you make year one as a head coach. Sometimes you think you know what you want as a coordinator, but then you actually get into real games. You get into the regular season and you see that, you know what, I want something different from a coordinator. And, going back to Wilks, look, he's got 14 games to improve. I'm not saying Wilks gets fired today. I'm not saying Wilks gets fired tomorrow, but things have to get better. And I think Glenn, one of the key decisions that Glenn will make this offseason, if things continue on their current path, and I have to tell you, I'm not optimistic about Wilks turning it around. I think that we've seen 3 games where the defenses looked so awful in so many ways. And I think part of the issue with the Jets defense right now is Wilks and Glenn kind of have the same flaw. And I think it's just too much of like that old school mentality, not enough modern thinking. Again, I like old school mentality in the right doses. What do I mean by old school mentality? Again, like the all-out blitzes, the lack of adjustments. Sometimes through the first 2 games, I'm not sure the Jets have gotten the rotations well enough on the right page on the defensive line. I think there have been instances where, especially in week 1, where the Jets had too many backup defensive linemen on the field at the same time. That's something that like an old school coach may do. A modern coach realizes I gotta balance, make sure there's enough talent on the field at all times. I gotta stagger when I give my defensive lineman rests, just things like that. And I think Glenn might need a defensive coordinator who brings more modern thinking to the position, because Glenn can give you the old school hard nosed stuff. That's what Glenn's good at. But I think with Wilks, maybe it's just too much of that. And you look across the roster, there are things that Glenn will need to address going forward. Part of it might be adjusting the playing time allocations, like I mentioned in the second segment, where maybe Glenn is an old school guy, likes to rely on veterans. Well, maybe he's got to start trusting his younger players a little bit more. Maybe he's got to give those younger guys some reps. And there are lots of things that the Jets will need to change between year 1 and year 2 of Aaron Glenn. I do think 3 games is far too short of a sample size to judge Aaron Glenn right now. I think that people are picking up on ridiculous things to get on him over, like the dance on the sideline after Will McDonald's blocked field goal gave the Jets the lead. Like the guy's in his first year as an NFL head coach. A guy of his just made a big play that turned a game around that looked like it was lost. It had an opportunity. We were 147 away from it being his first win as a head coach. Let the man dance. Let the man be excited. Again, I don't blame him for what he said at the press conference after Sunday's game. A lot of people got on him because he said, we're not the same old Jets. And the response from fans is, well, you look like the same old Jets. You blew a game that you had won. And that's a fair response from the fans. But I think you also have to remember that Glenn is dealing with a team with a lot of young players that's been hit by a tidal wave of negativity over the last couple of weeks. And I'm not just talking from the media or fans. I'm just saying the team's performance has been bad. He's trying to keep these guys focused. He's trying to keep these guys upbeat. He's trying to keep their mental state sharp, because it's a rough thing in the NFL when you get off to a bad start. I don't mind that. There are obviously things that are going to have to get better. And one of them is the Jets are going to need to make smarter decisions with the players they bring in here. Glenn talked a lot about his time as a scout. He said being a good coach requires being a good talent evaluator. Well, he wasn't a good talent evaluator this offseason when the Jets brought in guys like Brandon Stevens and Andre Sisco. And I have to admit, I was a bad talent evaluator with Sisco. I wasn't a big fan of Stevens. I got Sisco wrong, though. So bad job by me also. But it's a longer term deal. There are lots and lots of twists and turns in an NFL head coach's career. It's a long-term trajectory. It's not like something you decide in 3 games. it's not something you decide in 1 year. The only time I would even consider like making a change with a first-year head coach is in a situation like Gerard Mayo last year with the Patriots or Urban Meyer back in 2021 with the Jaguars, where the coach just lost the locker room immediately. Or a case like Adam Gase with the Jets, where you already knew the guy was a bad coach and you shouldn't have hired him, and things are going badly, and you just know things aren't going to turn around. Short of that, I think, it's one thing to say Glenn's doing a bad job. When I try and defend Glenn right here, I'm not saying he's doing a good job. What I'm saying is that we need to see a lot more from Glenn before we determine whether or not he's a good head coach. So I know you don't want to hear about patience, but patience is important. Anyway, that's all for today's episode. This has been the Locked On Jets podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Your team every day is our motto. As always, if you enjoyed the show, hit the subscribe button where you're watching or listening so that you never miss an episode. If you enjoy the show and are listening on a podcast source, give it a 5-star review. And if you're watching on YouTube and enjoy the show, give this episode a big thumbs up. Helps us out, helps other Jets fans find the podcast. Enjoy your Tuesday, everybody. And please send in your mailbag questions. Tomorrow we will do our weekly mailbag. Can't wait to answer them.